On the 18th of August 1945, 3 days after Japan's surrender to the Allies, the Indian nationalist leader Subhas Chandra Bose embarked on a flight to freedom. He was worshipped by millions. Tens of thousands were prepared to give their lives for him. Rubbing shoulders with the Nazis, Bose had only one goal: to kick the British out of India, even if it meant shaking hands with the devil. Beaten on the battlefield, Bose was heading for the Soviet Union. But his flight never arrived at its destination. The plane crashed. Bose died, or so the official version goes. In 2006, an Indian Judicial Commission concluded that the crash never happened.
He didn't die in the plane accident. Factually that he died, we couldn't get any evidence.
So what really happened to Subhas Chandra Bose? Could modern science solve one of India's greatest mysteries? Calcutta, the former capital of British India, the hometown of Subhas Chandra Bose. Anita Pfaff, Bose's only child and daughter, arrives at the city's airport, named after her father. Born and raised in Austria, Anita is an infrequent visitor to India.
So I'm happy now. I'm all right now.
Thankfully one can do these things today and bypass.
She's here to meet the veterans of the Indian National Army.
This unconditional dedication to a cause which they showed, I think makes them very unusual people. After decades of not having seen my father, they still hold an emotional tie to him, which is almost unbelievable.
In 1944, 40,000 of them had marched from Singapore to the jungles of India, together with the Japanese.
A man with unlimited courage. A man with a distant vision. A man who felt for the millions of people of India.
For many Indians, Subhas Chandra Bose has a unique place in history. He was the only nationalist leader who confronted the British Empire on the battlefield. Today, Anita Pfaff is on a personal journey of discovery about the father she never knew. Subhas was born into the family of a wealthy Indian lawyer in Bengal. He was sent to a British school, as his father considered himself a loyal supporter of the British Raj. The British had been the colonial masters of the Indian subcontinent for more than a century. Bringing unity and stability to the country, they ruled with the consent of India's governing classes. One day Subhas might become an officer under British command. But there was another side to India, far removed from the pressures of Subhas's family and of his English school. Absconding at the age of 15, young Bose discovered an ancient world of mysticism and magic.
In his teenage years, there was a rebellion. He ran away from home with a friend, went to northern India. It seemed to be a kind of spiritual seeking. He thought of himself as something of a pilgrim, of a searcher going out, searching for truth.
Bose moved to Calcutta. It fully struck him how British rule was ultimately racist, and how Indians were discriminated against by their European masters.
There was one club. It was meant for only for Europeans, not for others. Asiatics nahi, Indian nahi. So on the gate it was written, dogs and Indians are not allowed.
Subhas entered Presidency College. He's fondly remembered for standing up for the rights of his fellow Indians when he was a student here.
Being the child of any successful parent, you get a degree of reflected glory, whether you like it or not. In my case, of course, it's a bit easier because for most of the time, I live in a country where people do not know or do not take much account of who my father is. And I can sort of live my own life and not be cast in the shadow of my father, so to say.
Subhas passed his exams with flying colours. In 1919, he enrolled at Cambridge University in England to prepare for entry into the Indian Civil Service, the ICS.
In British India, you have pretty strong racism. In British India, he is a black man. He's an Indian. And in Britain, it's different.
After only 8 months of study, Subhas passed the extremely difficult Indian Civil Service exam. To his surprise, he was the 4th best in his year. It threw him into a personal crisis.
Does he want to be a servant of the British Raj? After he thinks about it for a while, he says no. The British, they're not thrilled that one of the top candidates would drop out, so they say, please reconsider, you don't know what you're giving up. And he says no.
Bose returned to India to begin a career as a politician, helped by the reputation of his Cambridge degree and by his family connections. The Calcutta region was prone to flooding. Poverty was endemic. Bose organised famine relief in eastern Bengal, impressing Indians and the British alike. But it was Bose's fervent nationalism that didn't go down well with the British colonial authorities. He soon organised protests and strikes against British rule. His declared goal was to kick the British out of India. There were even rumours that he had links with Bengali terrorists. It didn't take long until he was arrested. Time and again over the next 10 years, Bose was locked up for his anti-British activities. In prison, his health declined. To avoid turning him into a martyr, he was released into the care of his family. The precondition was that he left India for a lengthy period of time. In 1933, he boarded a ship to Europe. His destination was Austria, where he was diagnosed as having a stone in his gallbladder. After an operation, Bose's health gradually improved. As he couldn't be in India, he would continue his struggle on the international stage.
He calls himself, during this European period, Ambassador of India in Bondage. He wants Europeans, non-British, to support the efforts of India to obtain independence from the British Empire.
Writing his autobiography, he hired a young Austrian woman, Emilia Schenkel, as his secretary. The two fell in love and secretly got married.
One thing attracted my father, that basically she was a rather self-assured woman. She found him very attractive, very charming. He was one of the people who, of course, always wanted women to play a strong role, and that, of course, was an exceedingly unusual attitude for a man at that time, even more so than what it is today.
In India, there are many reminders of Bose's travels in the German-speaking world. It's made him hugely popular among the Indian young. For Anita, there is little she can do to escape her celebrity status as the daughter of one of India's greatest independence heroes. Back in 1933, Anita's father was heading from Vienna to Berlin. It was the beginning of the most controversial aspect of the Indian nationalist's life. He'd come to meet the Nazis who'd recently taken over power. Bose was impressed by the supposed efficiency of the Nazi regime. He told others that he wanted a combination of socialist ideals and fascist discipline for India. But he criticized that the Nazis considered Indians racially inferior. Bose held meetings with Nazi officials. He wanted Germany's political support for Indian independence and asked for a meeting with the Führer himself. But Hitler wasn't interested.
In his book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, written in the 1920s, Hitler declared that the British rule in India in the very best interest of the white person's race. So in that respect, he considered for very crude reasons that Indians cannot be trusted. Indians are unable to govern themselves. So this primitive racism prevented Bose to get any kind of systematic political alliance with Nazi Germany before 1941.
It was time to return to India. Bose's stay abroad had greatly increased his reputation as an ambassador of Indian independence.
I'm proud of my father because he was a man of great integrity. I think he must have been a very magnetic person. And those people who even saw him at a distance themselves, I had heard many incidents that they said, well, I just saw him from a distance and he looked at me and it made a difference to my life.
But there was someone who was even more popular than Bose.
Mahatma Gandhi is absolutely unique. Gandhi says the means are as important as the ends. If you have a goal and you use corrupt means, you use violent means to achieve it, you contaminate the goal that you seek.
Even though Subhas believed that the use of violence against the British was legitimate, Gandhi brought him into the mainstream of the Indian nationalist movement. He even ensured that Bose was elected president of the Indian National Congress Party.
Now, about Gandhi, you have to remember, although
he even ensured that Bose was elected president of the Indian National Congress Party.
Now, about Gandhi, you have to remember, although he sounds like a saint, he's a politician. He's a master of raising money. He's a master of propaganda. He's a master of choosing men who will help him.
But Bose became disillusioned with the lack of zeal amongst Congress leaders, like Jawaharlal Nehru, Gandhi's favorite political protege. Subhas publicly advocated the use of violence against the British.
India is going to be free. Our struggle is no doubt a non-violent struggle. But even a non-violent struggle demands an army, an organization, and a machinery.
Gandhi was shocked, and Bose was forced to resign. He rallied the radical Indian left around him and set up a new political party, the Forward Bloc. But events a long way from India were working against him.
Der Großangriff auf London nimmt seinen Anfang.
Britain was under attack by Nazi Germany. In August 1940, German bombers were flying raids against London. There was widespread talk of an imminent invasion. Britain's ultra-conservative new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, advocated a tough hand in India, while the war in Europe was threatening the survival of Britain as an independent nation. Now wasn't the time to go soft on Indian nationalists.
Churchill is a great war leader for Great Britain and a disaster for India. He talks about Indians in such an incredibly condescending, almost racist way that he is hated in India.
Bose and his followers were arrested. The Forward Bloc movement came to a halt.
Bose had undertaken a hunger strike in prison, and the British did not want him to die on their hands, and so had allowed him to go home with the intention of rearresting him as soon as he regained his health.
But Bose managed to escape. In disguise, he headed north. He then walked across the border into Afghanistan. His life was in great danger, as newly discovered documents prove.
From London, an order went out to the Special Operations Executive in Istanbul and Cairo that they should wire what arrangements they could make for Subhash Chandra Bose's assassination. Clearly, the British saw him as their most resourceful and inveterate opponent, and during the war, they were prepared to go to any lengths to stop him.
Afghanistan was the playground of the world's intelligence services. Everywhere, Bose had to suspect a British agent. His cover was about to be blown when he received an exit visa. Bose boarded a train and headed north. His first stop was Moscow.
Bose was always very much impressed by the Soviet Union, by Lenin, even by Stalin, and he was always interested to get the kind of relationship with the Soviet politicians.
But Stalin didn't trust the Indian nationalist. He feared that Bose might be a British agent. Subhas only received a transit visa and was forced to continue his journey. His final destination was Germany, which had a non-aggression treaty with the Soviet Union. The political situation had changed fundamentally since his last visit to Berlin. The Nazis were at the height of their power, the masters of Western and Central Europe. Bose wanted to enlist their help in his struggle for Indian independence.
In the early 40s, he felt that the old imperialisms of the British and the French and the Dutch were in conflict with the new imperialisms of Germany, Japan, and Italy. And the colonized countries of Asia might as well take advantage of that conflict to press for their own freedom.
Within 6 days of his arrival in Berlin, Bose requested Germany and Italy to make statements in support of Indian independence. He also demanded money and military aid. But Bose's memorandum to the German government met with polite silence. Hitler was busy putting the final touches to a plan he'd been harboring since the 1920s. On the 22nd of June 1941, the German Wehrmacht attacked the Soviet Union. Bose was shocked. He'd always seen Russia as another natural ally in his fight against Britain. But the German attack on the Soviet Union offered new opportunities. Hitler had ordered that once Russia had fallen, the Wehrmacht would continue its advance all the way to India. Suddenly, Bose was of interest to the Germans. They agreed to support him with money and gave him diplomatic status.
Subhash Chandra Bose certainly knew about the dark side of Nazi ideology, and I think he was making some kind of a Faustian bargain, in order to end what he saw as the scourge of British rule in India. He was prepared to, even shake hands with the devil.
Bose assumed the title of Netaji, which means leader or Führer. He received an office and an organization, the Free India Center, with a staff of more than 30 people. Bose's first task was to broadcast anti-British propaganda to India. With his new title of Netaji, he addressed his followers back at home.
When he started his speech, Ami Subhas, I'm Subhas. Tears started rolling from the eyes of his mother.
Bose wanted to reach the 2 million Indian volunteers of the British Indian Army. These men were the bedrock of the British Raj.
He believed that Britain's Indian Army was the ultimate instrument of colonial control, not just in India, but in the British Empire worldwide. And therefore he set out to undermine the loyalty of Indian soldiers to the King Emperor and replace it with a new allegiance to the Indian nation.
It was on the battlefields of North Africa that Bose's propaganda activities were most dangerous to the British. Here, thousands of Indian soldiers were fighting alongside British troops against the Nazis. In 1941, the Germans had the upper hand. 32,000 British and Commonwealth troops were taken prisoner. Among them were 10,000 Indians. From his new offices in Berlin, where Bose had been joined by his Austrian wife Emilia, the Netaji kept a close eye on these developments. His focus was on the sleepy German town of Annaburg, south of Berlin. During the war, it was the arrival point for the nearby POW camp of Königsbrück. In the autumn of 1941, the first detachment of British Indian prisoners arrived here by train. They'd been specially separated from their British comrades. Bose soon paid the camp a visit. The Netaji proposed that the Indian POWs should join a special Indian legion within the Wehrmacht, loyal to himself and to Adolf Hitler.
My husband accompanied them as an interpreter, and he explained that the Sikhs, the ones with the turbans, it was always very difficult to convince them. They always started talking about the salt. We eat English salt, and we swore an oath to them. Bose didn't react angrily. He said, I understand that, but it's your land you're working for. Your land needs to be free, and everything we can do, we're doing it for ourselves. And the Sikhs accepted that.
A total of 3,500 Indian soldiers signed up. Though part of the Wehrmacht, their goal was the liberation of India.
The National Socialist arrogance with respect to the Indians, that wasn't really relevant for us. On the contrary, we thought, okay, they're different. And maybe they're not what you expect from a German soldier either. But that's why they're Indians. We have to accept that.
The Indian soldiers who marched through Königsbrück left their songs here, their tunes.
Das ging dann so, Jimbadau, Agidau, Milkosa de Vi, Margidau, Margidau, Linkingi Shumsi.
Ageau, Kadambarau, Milkosa de Vi. Also,
onward with a determined stride, all joined together.
Alle zusammengeschlossen.
And now comes the interesting part. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs and Christians, all brothers to one another. And that was the point. We wanted to have a community for the future of India. And we were successful.
Am Hohen Drahtzaun standen
slim, handsome men stood at the tall chain-link fence with turbans, very exotic. For us, it was something right out of Aladdin or 1001 Nights. Yes, we were attracted to them somehow. I saw all the Indians, and they all appealed to me. They were really very, very smart soldiers. I don't know if smart is the right word, but they were very well-dressed soldiers. They had very nice uniforms, and they were always immaculately dressed. All the girls lusted after the Indians at the time. Me too.
Bose's Indian Legion appeared in a Nazi newsreel. Ironically, one of the world's fiercest critics of European colonialism could be seen allied to the world's most racist and imperialistic state. But the Wehrmacht's war against Russia wasn't going well. The chances of reaching India were slim. Bose was looking for new allies. The Japanese were much closer to India than the Germans. After its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan had entered the war on Germany's side. Sweeping down the Malay Peninsula, the Japanese had caught the British forces in Southeast Asia than the Germans. After its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan had entered the war on Germany's side. Sweeping down the Malay Peninsula, the Japanese had caught the British forces in Southeast Asia napping. The British garrison in Singapore was forced to surrender. Winston Churchill called it the biggest defeat in British history. Among the 130,000 Allied prisoners were tens of thousands of Indians. Back in Berlin, Bose visited the Japanese embassy to offer his services. He'd set up an Indian Legion in Germany and wanted to do the same in Southeast Asia, together with the Japanese. It was agreed that he would make his way to Japan as soon as possible. But first Bose travelled to the German military headquarters in East Prussia to meet the man he'd been chasing for years. Bose's prestige in Germany was at a high. He wanted to convince the Führer to give his public support for Indian independence. Their handshake was captured on camera, but the meeting didn't go as well as Bose had planned.
He was disappointed because Hitler was not prepared to issue a declaration in support of Indian independence. Hitler wouldn't do it, Ribbentrop wouldn't do it either. No one would.
Despite the disappointment, the mere fact of Bose's meeting with Hitler was an extraordinary propaganda coup for the Netaji. It was seized upon by friends and foes alike. In India, it's long become part of the Netaji folklore. At the opening of a new school in Chennai, the event is staged in honor of the Netaji's daughter, even if it feels a bit uncomfortable.
If you look at the motivation of his work, which was to fight against the colonial power Great Britain, which suppressed his home country, he was looking for support from others, and where would he find it? Certainly not in the United States or France or many of the other European countries who were colonial powers themselves. So he was looking for support with the enemy of his enemy, so to say.
Jai Hind war der Gruß, der in Berlin erfunden wurde.
Jai Hind was the greeting that was coined in Berlin.
Und wo sich alle
Everyone wanted to use the phrase, "Long live India."
begrüßen wollten, und
And that's what they did.
durchgeführt worden.
Perhaps it's no longer in use today. Although if you greet one of the old boys with Jai Hind, they still understand.
Dann verstehen die das immer noch.
Jai Hind!
Jai Hind!
Back in Berlin, the Netaji was getting impatient. It would be months before a U-boat was available for his trip to Japan. Bose used the time to hold an international conference on India. It introduced a piece of music that would later become India's national anthem.
Den Kampf bis zum Siege weiterzuführen, zu bekräftigen. In diesem Kampf, der für Indien ein Kampf Sein oder Nichtsein ist, kann es nur einen Ausgang geben, unseren gemeinsamen Ziel. Lang leben die drei Paktmächte und ihre Verbündeten. Lang lebe das freie Indien.
Da hat große Pläne entwickelt. Das ging ja über
He had great plans, beyond new stamps and coins for India. He had ideas on the postal system. He had ideas on how to organize the police. In the opinion of German observers, he was so advanced in his thinking that if India had become independent, he could have implemented his ideas for a new government immediately.
Staatsführung und der Regierung hätte umsetzen können.
Bose considered the German police to be the perfect model for an independent India. He even managed to get an appointment with the Nazis' leading police expert. It was Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS, architect of the final solution. Amazingly, the Nazis' most murderous racist made Bose feel extremely welcome.
Heinrich Himmler hatte sich jahrelang mit Indien beschäftigt.
Heinrich Himmler had been preoccupied with India for years. He knew about Indian culture, about Indian literature like Shakuntala, etc., and he was interested in learning more about India under British rule, politically and economically.
Unter britischer Herrschaft jetzt stand, zu erfahren.
In 1938, Himmler had even sent an expedition of SS scientists to Tibet, believing it to be the original heartland of the Germanic tribes. A film about the expedition was shown in German cinemas and had been hugely popular. During their meeting, Himmler promised Bose that he would protect the Indian Legion. They parted on good terms. The following day, Bose returned to Berlin. Himmler's next appointment was in Auschwitz. For Amelia, these were anxious times. She was several months pregnant.
She certainly was not very happy, I'm sure. But I think she always accepted that his love for India came first, and any personal kind of responsibility or affection would have to be in second or third place. I doubt that she argued with him to do anything different, because it certainly would not have had any effect.
In November, Amelia gave birth to a baby girl, Anita. 3 months later, Bose's time of waiting came to an end. He boarded the German submarine U-180 and quietly slipped away, leaving behind his wife and daughter. To avoid being detected by British destroyers in the English Channel, Bose's U-boat was heading for the icy waters north of Scotland. Billy Carnot was one of the German submarine's torpedo engineers.
It was our great fortune that there was a storm with wind force 12. No patrol boats could last in the area, and aeroplanes couldn't take off either. At the same time, the thermometer dropped to about -10 degrees Celsius. It was so cold that our deck gun turned into a gigantic block of ice. Mr. Bose and Mr. Hassan fared extremely poorly in the rough sea. They spent most of the time in their berths. They were green and yellow. They almost changed color.
Verschwand ja ganz heimlich. Und es durfte
He
niemand
disappeared secretly, and no one was allowed to say where he had actually gone or where he was. That was why our soldiers felt abandoned. Bose was no longer there.
Bose war nicht mehr da.
It was actually a happy time. We had a special status, and that saved our lives.
Meanwhile, Bose's U-boat headed for the Indian Ocean. He was to be transferred to a Japanese submarine that would take the Netaji all the way to Japan.
Bose hat sich schrecklich gefürchtet.
Bose was terrified. He absolutely refused to get into the Japanese dinghy because when he saw it, he realized he would be in water up to his backside. Even after trying to persuade him, he wouldn't go. So we had to prepare our dinghy, which had a solid bottom. And in the end, it was us pushing him rather than him going. All around us there were triangular fins, a sign that there were sharks nearby.
The Japanese submarine managed to carry Bose all the way to Southeast Asia. From there, he boarded a flight to Tokyo.
We are now living in a period.
Addressing the Japanese government, Bose was elated.
Within the ranks of the Indian National Congress, you see today.
He always felt more comfortable with the Japanese than he had ever felt with the Germans. I think he made a much greater impact. He made no impact on Hitler. He was a flea. He was an Indian flea to Hitler. To Tojo, he was a real person, the head of a, or at least the potential head of a freedom movement who could ally with the Japanese and perhaps raise a big rebellion which would help the Japanese to defeat the British in Southeast Asia.
Bose now proceeded to Singapore. He received a hero's welcome by thousands of Indian volunteers. Bose now proceeded to Singapore. He received a hero's welcome by thousands of Indian volunteers, members of the Indian National Army under Japanese command. They were ready to fight the British, but had lacked a charismatic Indian leader.
Netaji is there. My dream was realized, and I was quite sure that Netaji will get India freedom. And our whole army, there were more than 50,000 Indians. We were ready to sacrifice ourselves, but get India independent.
Bose told his followers that together with the Japanese, an attack on British India had every chance of success.
Subhas Bose said, oh, as soon as we get into India, hundreds of thousands of people will rise up and fight against the British. Some truly believed in what Subhas Bose was preaching, which is, we are now going to fight for our own freedom. Why should we fight for the victories of the British Empire? Let's fight for Indian freedom. And that's what he persuaded some of them to do. One of the unique features of the Indian National Army was that there was a women's regiment. They were trained to fight, they were given small arms training, and many of them were teenage girls, recruited from the Indian population in Southeast Asia. There were 3 million Indians in Southeast Asia. These young women, he felt as if they were his adopted daughters. He called them the Ranis, the Rani of Jhansi Regiment, after this princess, the Rani of Jhansi.
One of the women officers in the INA was Lakshmi Sehgal. A trained medical doctor, she still runs a hospital in Calcutta.
My daughter. He said, but I'm a very, people may think I'm a cruel man. I'm still not satisfied. I want women also to join the regiment and form a regiment of their own, because they form half the population, and unless they also fight for the freedom of the country, they can't expect to get their rights after freedom. So women also must join.
At the beginning of 1944, the Indian National Army joined the Japanese advance towards India.
The Japanese generals and officers had a lot of respect for Bose. And some of them said to me privately, there is no person in the war who more fully fit the ideal of a samurai than Subhas Chandra Bose.
Subhas Chandra Bose was actually desperate somehow to get into Bengal, perhaps reach Calcutta, because he felt that then there would be, in fact, be a big civilian uprising in India. And his Indian National Army was simply meant to be a catalyst for a much larger civilian uprising inside the country.
In March 1944, Japanese and INA forces went on the offensive. The Japanese expected an easy victory, just like in 1942. But this time, the British were ahead of the game.
The Japanese had one of their worst defeats in the war, and the Indian National Army, recreated by Subhas Bose from the original Indian National Army, was just massacred.
Newly released documents show that a double agent, codenamed Silver, had given the British advance knowledge of the Japanese attack. His real name was Bhagat Ram Talwar. An insider, he'd received the information from the unsuspecting Netaji himself. Bose had believed that the Indian troops fighting for the British would surrender to the advancing INA. Instead, it was Bose's forces who were surrendering to the Allies.
There are defeats on the road to victory. That this is a big setback, but the cause of Indian freedom continues in some other way. I think that he understands that this is going to have a propaganda effect in India.
After the war, the British would put 3 generals of the Indian National Army on trial in the Red Fort in Delhi.
One was a Muslim, Shah Nawaz Khan. Another was a Hindu, P.K. Saigal. And another was a Sikh, Guru Baksh Singh Dhillon. Suddenly there was this Muslim, Sikh, all together in it.
The INA trial would cause a nationwide outcry.
The political miscalculation by the British is so enormous to give publicity to the actions which Indians are going to see as patriotic, to give them enormous publicity, just a stupefying mistake by the British and General Auchinleck. Anyway, they're put on trial, they're convicted, treason against the king, emperor, they're sentenced to transportation for life, that is life imprisonment, and then they're released. I mean, the demonstrations in India on behalf of the Indian National Army and the knowledge that was coming out about the struggle of this army of Subhas Bose to fight with the Japanese for the liberation from the British Empire gets out after the war, and they're now considered heroes and martyrs.
But even a non-violent struggle demands an army, an organization, and a machinery.
12 months before the trials, on the 18th of August 1945, 3 days after Japan's surrender to the Allies, Bose was still full of confidence about his political future. He decided to fly to Manchuria and surrender to the forces of the Soviet Union and continue his struggle for Indian independence.
I think Subhas would have gotten fantastic admiration after independence, and I think he could have been a cabinet minister, he could have been a leader of a very important opposition socialist party, but he would have had a very important role to play. He was a relatively young man, he was 48 years old.
But the plane was overloaded. After a stopover in Japanese-occupied Formosa, it developed engine trouble. According to witnesses, the plane crashed. Bose died as a result of severe burns. He was cremated, and his remains were sent to a Buddhist temple in Japan, where they're still kept today.
The first was a shock. After all, when you suddenly hear the news of the death of a very near one, you are shocked. You are deeply grieved.
News of Bose's death was broadcast around the world. Eventually, it reached his widow, Emilia, in Vienna.
After she got the news of my father's death, she was really devastated, evidently. She said that I really wanted to end life, but it's my child that caused me to cling. So I think it was a very difficult thing, but she was rather strong in the sense of sort of dealing with it and also not constantly complaining about it.
But not everyone believed that the Netaji died in 1945. Some suggested that he'd made it to the Soviet Union, where he was locked up in a labor camp. Others believed Bose escaped altogether.
When we heard about the plane crash and he died, we who knew that this sort of fake news has been broadcasted many times, and this may be one of the tricks.
Even today, the question of Bose's death or disappearance in 1945 divides the people of India. Recently, an official commission appointed by the Indian government presented the findings of a 6-year investigation into Bose's death. Chaired by a former High Court judge, the Mukherjee Commission's findings shocked the nation.
He was such a beloved leader of the country, the people must know about what happened ultimately. My findings are, so to speak, is partial, in the sense that I have only said the earlier findings of his death is not correct, the ashes are not his.
The Commission's findings are highly sensitive. If Bose didn't die in the plane crash, why did he never reappear in public? He could have played a major role before and after Indian independence in 1947. According to the most popular conspiracy theory, India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, knew that Bose hadn't died in a plane crash.
Some elements are that Bose was in a Soviet prison and he lived there for decades even, and Nehru did everything to convince Stalin that Bose should stay in that prison, not be allowed to come back. It was in Nehru's interest that Bose did not reappear in independent India. It must be Nehru's doing. There is no proof for that, but it's interesting that these conspiracy theories, even when in 1997 there was Bose's 100th birthday, still some conspiracy theories were very much alive.
Anita Pfaff has always believed in the official version of events. She's also argued that a DNA test of Bose's remains is unnecessary. She's now changed her mind on the test.
As a consequence of the report of the last inquiry commission, I have written to the priest of Renkochi temple asking him to agree to providing bone samples for a DNA test. What I've heard is that he would want to have an okay of the Indian and the Japanese government, and I hope we will eventually get the government to stop dilly-dallying and agree to having this test done and then see what the results are.
Subhas Chandra Bose, India's most controversial nationalist. Wooed by both pacifists and generals, he was prepared to shake hands with the devil in pursuit of his dreams. 6 decades after his death or disappearance, Bose still has the power to electrify the nation.
My father was always a mystery man, it seems, and he has left us with a couple of mysteries which stay with us, and the circumstances of his death are certainly one important issue.
Netadi, Netadi.
ಹೆಚ್ಚಿನ ವಿಡಿಯೋಗಳಿಗೆ ಪ್ರತಿಧ್ವನಿ ಯೂಟ್ಯೂಬ್ ಚಾನೆಲ್ ಸಬ್ಸ್ಕ್ರೈಬ್ ಮಾಡಿ, ಬೆಲ್ ಐಕಾನ್ ಕ್ಲಿಕ್ ಮಾಡಿ.